for my demonstrated speech, I am going to show you how to put together a motherboard. Now, when I say put together a motherboard, I mean put together the CPU cooler, the GPU, and the RAM. Now, this is not to build an entire computer, like this beautiful machine behind me. Now, this is just enough to put together a motherboard, since that's a very generic kind of thing you have, depending on the CPU and other parts that I'll go over during this video. But other than that, let's get started. Now, we're not going to be working on that beautiful piece of machinery behind me. That thing is worth more than Kim Kardashian's inheritance to me, and I will not lay a finger on it unless I have to. So instead, we're going to work on this 10-year-old mistake. But it'll work.
Now, the basic necessities for a motherboard itself is a CPU cooler, some RAM, and in this case we have 4, and of course, the motherboard. Now, even though this motherboard is 10 to 11 years old, most motherboards of today follow along the same lines. The CPU that we'll be using today is an AMD Phenom 2. Now, this thing is heavily used, but one of the interesting things about it is... let me try and actually get it to zoom in properly so you can actually see how heavily used it is. But, like I was saying, other than its age, is how the pins are arranged. The pins are arranged in a way where it will fit into an AMD socket motherboard. Now, Intel, on the other hand, has the pins inside of the motherboard and the pin sockets inside the CPU itself. That's why some of the boards and CPUs aren't interchangeable. Now, in order to put this CPU inside of this motherboard, there's a special triangle that's on the edge of the CPU. Now, that's on most CPUs, give or take a few rare occurrences, and the motherboard has the same triangle on the corner of the CPU socket, and that one is located right here. So if I go ahead and just line up these here triangles, it should slide in just perfectly. Yep, just like that. Now, before I put in this CPU cooler, there is one thing I forgot to do. And that thing is, you may not be able to see it, but there is a lever where the CPU socket is. And that lever is right here. And all you really have to do is just push it down and it locks in place. Simple as that. Now, there was one thing I forgot to add in the beginning of this video, and that is thermal paste. Thermal paste is very important. What it does is it evenly distributes the heat between what would be copper or some sort of heat sink and the CPU itself. Now, you don't have to add too much. Really, it should only be about the size of a grain of rice. And once the CPU is mounted on there, the pressure will make it spread perfectly and evenly. Now, this CPU right here is made out of copper and it has fins, like a radiator. That way it evenly distributes the heat away from the CPU and actively cools it with a fan that is located on top. And what I just showed there was how it actually attaches to this motherboard. Some fans or CPU coolers will attach differently, but this one right here came with a bracket that I attached to the back plate that was located on this motherboard with the screws that you see there. And now you see me struggle to actually clip these things on. When they are put on there, they are put on there hard. They are meant to have even distribution along the entire surface of the CPU to make sure that it cools it effectively. Next we have RAM. Now this RAM right here is a 2GB stick of DDR3 RAM. Now generally when it comes to RAM, the most important thing is just the size. It doesn't matter what megahertz you have it at, generally you will never see any kind of difference whatsoever. To insert the RAM into the motherboard, it's actually fairly easy. You see, there's a notch right here that's on the RAM stick, and there is a corresponding notch in the corresponding DIMM slots or RAM slots that are right here. Now, if I only had 2 sticks of RAM, the rule of thumb is to put them in the corresponding channels that are farthest away from the CPU. Now, if you have a 4-channel motherboard, there are 2 parts of it. As you can see here, it's the white and the blue part. You would put each stick of RAM in the separate channel that is farthest away from the CPU. But since I have 4 sticks of RAM, it doesn't matter, so I'm just going to stick them all in there. Once they're in though, you need to make sure that they are pushed in until you see those clips on the side click. You'll actually hear an audible click too when you push them in. Now, of course, the CPU cooler needs to be plugged into the motherboard in order to have power and to properly cool down the CPU. That way it gets temperature readings and can actually speed up or slow down according to them. Now, the way you find out where the plug is that it has this notch on the side, and you'll find a corresponding 3 to 4 pin slot on the motherboard where it just slips right in. Now, I can't help but feel like I'm forgetting something. Right! So, because I was so confused by the fact that this was not inside of a case yet, here's the GPU, or graphics card. Now, the GPU itself actually gets installed into this PCIe port right here that has a notch. Not these two. These two are just PCI ports, not PCIe. And while I'm pointing things out, this right here is a 24-pin power connector. This right here is connected for your CD/DVD drive. These are SATA ports for your storage. These are for your case, like your power button and everything like that. And everything else is pretty much useless to you. You will not need to care about it, I guarantee you. For just the basics, we will focus on that. And this right here is actually the graphics card PCIe part. This is the male part and this is the female part. Now, normally you would not insert this into the motherboard until it was in a case. But since I'm not actually showing you how to build an entire PC and just how to put a motherboard together, all you gotta do is actually just properly line it up and, well, I gotta lift it up, but push it in there just like that. And voila! That right there is a motherboard.